Before dawn on June 6, 1944, the coast of northern France lay shrouded in darkness and silence. The German defenders stationed along the Atlantic Wall believed the violent winds and high waves made any Allied landing impossible that night. Yet, far out in the English Channel, the greatest armada in human history was already on the move. Over 5,000 ships, carrying more than 150,000 soldiers, inched toward Normandy under a veil of secrecy and storm clouds. The fate of Europe rested upon this single morning. Inside cramped landing craft, young men from America, Britain, and Canada clutched their rifles and whispered prayers. The smell of salt, fuel, and fear filled the air. Many had never seen combat before. Some had only turned 20. As the engines roared and the waves pounded, each soldier knew the cost of failure. Operation Overlord had to succeed, or the dream of liberating Europe would die before it began. At precisely 0:15, the first Allied paratroopers leapt into the night sky over Normandy. Thousands of parachutes bloomed in the darkness like pale ghosts. Their mission: to capture bridges, cut off German reinforcements, and sow confusion behind enemy lines. Many landed miles from their intended drop zones, tangled in trees or crashing into flooded fields. Still, they pressed on. Small, scattered groups of paratroopers waged chaotic battles in hedgerows and villages, disrupting the German defense before the main invasion began. Out at sea, the Allied fleet moved in relentless formation. The naval commanders faced enormous risks. German mines, submarines, and coastal artillery could annihilate them before reaching shore. As dawn approached, destroyers and battleships opened fire. The night exploded into flame and thunder. Shells rained down on German bunkers and gun emplacements, shaking the earth along a 50-mile front. For the soldiers waiting to land, the thunderous barrage offered both comfort and terror. It meant the invasion had begun. At 6:30, the first wave of landing craft hit the beaches. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword, names that would forever be etched into history. The ramps dropped, and men stormed into knee-deep water under a hail of bullets. At Omaha Beach, American troops faced a nightmare. The German defenses were untouched by the naval bombardment. Machine guns swept the shore, cutting men down before they could even reach the sand. Medics fought to save the wounded while officers shouted orders drowned by the roar of artillery. Despite the slaughter, the Allies refused to break. Engineers cleared mines and obstacles under fire. Tanks crawled out of the surf, and small groups of survivors clawed their way up the bluffs. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood. By midday, the beachheads were secured, but at an unimaginable cost. The first hours of D-Day had already claimed thousands of lives. Yet the foothold on Fortress Europe had been established. As the smoke cleared and the tide carried away the bodies of the fallen, the survivors looked inland toward Normandy's hedgerows and villages. Ahead lay weeks of brutal fighting through fields, towns, and forests. But for the first time in 4 long years, Allied soldiers stood once again on the soil of occupied France. The long-awaited liberation of Europe had begun, not with glory, but with courage, sacrifice, and unimaginable loss. For those who lived through the morning of June 6, 1944, time seemed to stand still. The sky burned with tracer fire, the sea ran red, and the world held its breath. Historians would later call it the longest day. But for the men who fought it, it was the day hope returned to a continent in chains. The morning of June 6, 1944, unfolded into a scene of unimaginable chaos. The first waves of Allied soldiers who reached the Normandy beaches found themselves trapped in a deadly storm of gunfire, explosions, and confusion. What had been planned as a precise military operation quickly became a brutal struggle for survival. The air was thick with smoke, the sea churned with debris and bodies, and the sand turned dark with blood. On Omaha Beach, the situation was near catastrophic. The tide had pushed the landing craft far off course, scattering units and wrecking any sense of order. The German defenses, hidden in fortified bunkers high above the shore, unleashed relentless machine gun fire. Mortar shells tore through the waves, shredding boats before they even reached land. Men who jumped into the surf were dragged down by heavy gear or cut down before their boots touched the sand. The beach was littered with burning wreckage, tanks, trucks, and landing craft turned into twisted metal graves. Communication collapsed. Radios were soaked with seawater, officers were dead or wounded, and young soldiers had to make decisions on instinct. Amid the chaos, small groups began crawling forward, inch by inch, using shell craters for cover. Engineers tried to clear mines and obstacles under fire, many of them dying in the attempt. Every few meters, the cries of the wounded echoed over the surf. Still, the men pressed on, not out of command but out of sheer will. Further west at Utah Beach, the story unfolded differently. A strong current had carried the American 4th Division nearly 2 kilometers south of their intended landing zone. By luck, the area was less defended. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the oldest man in the first wave, calmly assessed the mistake. "We'll start the war from right here," he said, and led his men inland. Within hours, Utah Beach was secured. On the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, resistance was fierce but coordinated. The Allies faced mines, concrete bunkers, and artillery fire from villages inland. Yet careful planning and tank support began to pay off. Specialized Hobart's funnies, modified tanks designed to clear obstacles and mines, played a crucial role in breaking through the defenses. By mid-morning, the British and Canadians had pushed off the beaches and begun linking their positions. But at Omaha, the nightmare continued. The rising tide threatened to trap the wounded. Corpses floated in the surf. Every wave brought another group of soldiers into the killing zone. At one point, General Omar Bradley considered withdrawing entirely. The losses were that severe. Yet on the ground, courage began to turn the tide. A few determined officers rallied survivors, shouting and waving them forward. They scaled the cliffs, tossed grenades into German positions, and fought hand to hand in the bunkers above. By noon, pockets of resistance began to crumble. The defenders were running low on ammunition, their communication lines severed by naval bombardment. One by one, German gun nests fell silent. Smoke and the stench of gunpowder filled the air. The beaches were finally in Allied hands, shattered, burning, but held. When the shooting slowed, the scale of the carnage became clear. Thousands lay dead or wounded. Medics moved among the fallen, searching for any sign of life. Chaplains knelt beside the dying. The cost of victory was staggering, but the impossible had been achieved. A foothold in Nazi-occupied France. Behind the lines, officers began organizing reinforcements. Supplies, ammunition, and vehicles poured ashore as engineers built makeshift roads. The once deadly beaches transformed into lifelines for the liberation of Europe. As night fell on June 6th, exhausted soldiers dug into the sand and mud, listening to the distant rumble of artillery inland. They had survived the longest day barely. Around them lay the wreckage of war, burned tanks, shattered helmets, and the bodies of friends. Yet through the smoke and the grief, one truth remained. The beaches of Normandy were theirs. By the evening of June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were scarred, silent, and smoking. Thousands of men had fallen, but the impossible had been achieved. The Allies were back on the European continent. The greatest invasion in history had succeeded, but the battle for France, and for the future of the world, was only beginning. Behind the lines, commanders moved swiftly to consolidate the fragile beachhead. Engineers worked through the night, clearing mines, unloading supplies, and building makeshift roads across the sand. The once chaotic shorelines of Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword were now lifelines, the arteries through which men, machines, and ammunition would flow into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. The first day had cost nearly 10,000 Allied casualties, but the door to liberation was now open. Inland, small villages and hedgerows became deadly battlegrounds. Normandy's terrain, a maze of narrow lanes, stone walls, and dense fields, favored the defenders. The German army, though shocked by the scale of the invasion, began to regroup. Elite divisions, including the feared panzer units, moved toward the front. The Allies, still pinned close to the coast, faced fierce counterattacks. Every town had to be taken street by street, house by house. Progress was measured in meters, not miles. The paratroopers who had landed the night before continued their desperate missions behind enemy lines. Many had been isolated for over 24 hours, cut off and surrounded. Yet they held key bridges and crossroads, blocking German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Their courage and endurance kept the invasion alive. In places like Saint-Mire-Église and Corentin, their stubborn defense became legend. Meanwhile, Allied air superiority began to show its true power. Thousands of aircraft dominated the skies over Normandy, cutting off German supply lines, bombing railroads, and strafing convoys. For the first time in the war, the German army could no longer move freely during daylight. Every movement risked destruction from above. The Luftwaffe, once feared, was a shadow of its former self. As days turned into weeks, the Allies slowly expanded their control. The port of Cherbourg fell after brutal fighting, giving the Allies their first major supply harbor. Then came the push toward Caen, a city crucial for control of the region. British and Canadian forces fought a grinding, relentless battle there, facing well-entrenched German armor. Caen was reduced to rubble before it finally fell, a symbol of both Allied determination and the terrible cost of war. By mid-July, the German front was cracking. Hitler had insisted that his generals hold every inch of ground, refusing to allow tactical retreats. The result was disaster. Allied artillery and air power pulverized the German defenses. Operation Cobra, led by General Omar Bradley, broke through at Saint-Lô, unleashing American armored divisions into open country for the first time. Within days, Allied tanks were racing across Normandy. What had begun as a static beachhead was now a full-scale breakout. The German army, trapped and desperate, tried to counterattack near Falaise, but it was too late. The Allies encircled tens of thousands of enemy troops in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. The destruction was total. German losses in men and equipment crippled their ability to defend France. The road to Paris lay open. On August 25, 1944, after nearly 3 months of brutal fighting, the Allied armies entered the French capital. Parisians poured into the streets, cheering, weeping, and embracing their liberators. Church bells rang for the first time since the German occupation began. For the soldiers who had stormed the beaches of Normandy, it was a moment of redemption, proof that their sacrifice had not been in vain. France was free again, but the war was far from over. Ahead lay the push into Belgium, the Netherlands, and finally Germany itself. Hitler's regime was collapsing, but it would lash out in desperation before the end. Still, after D-Day, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. The Allies had gained the upper hand, militarily, psychologically, and strategically. The liberation of Western Europe was unstoppable. The invasion of Normandy did not just change the course of a battle. It changed the direction of history. In one bold stroke, the Allies had begun the end of Nazi tyranny. The courage of the soldiers, sailors, and airmen who fought on D-Day ensured that freedom would return to a continent enslaved by darkness. As the sun set on that first day, June 6, 1944, few of those men could have imagined how their actions would echo through time. Many would never live to see victory, but their deeds would shape the modern world. The beaches of Normandy, once covered in blood and chaos, became sacred ground, a testament to sacrifice, unity, and the enduring fight for liberty. The tide of World War II had turned. The Allies were on the march, and from that moment forward, the fall of Hitler's empire was only a matter of time.